Hello. Today we're going to talk about the stellar nations of the dragons. And today, in time, it's April 12th, 2024. And 2024 is the year that the energy of the stellar nations of the great felines and the stellar nations of the dragons is coming forward into our collective consciousness. And I did make a video about the stellar nation of the great felines to introduce what happened to them, or that it's really that part of us in cosmic history, and how that's played out and been healed on a cosmic level. And that energy has been coming in. That was apprehended in Hungary actually at the end of last year. They did a very big anchoring ceremony with that great feline energy at the winter solstice. And now the energy of the dragon has become more apprehendable, and they anchored the patterns of the healed dragon, and they just did that on the spring equinox, so not too long ago. And we're going to talk now about what are these patterns. So the stellar nation of the dragons, Liltianos Draco, this is the part of us that's the heart of the warrior, keepers of divine order, keepers of the divine power and the divine will, really seeing that the heavenly laws or the divine matrix is honored. And we use the word warrior. It's truly really about being able or willing to stand up for a higher principle. And that can happen in our everyday lives. You know, we show up with our families that way, or at our jobs, or we have values that we stand up for. So it's not about going to war. It's an instinct to stand up for something. And it's actually quite wonderful. It's not this onerous, heavy energy as we've come to think of it in the world because we're so imbued with war. It's also a very protective energy. I mean, to have someone with strong warrior codes in our family or even of ourselves, there's a sense of wanting to keep order and safety and provide protection. So it's a beautiful energy. And I did speak about in the Great Feline video, there's some background information that'll help there as we move into this. But I did speak about how this energy of the great felines and the dragons is what's known as a body code. We carry this awareness through our body. So even if you don't have strong dragon codes in your own self, you're likely to have it somewhere around you. You're going to see it in the world around you or in your family. Perhaps your child suddenly, your teenage boy suddenly wants to start lifting weights, or you do. That's something perhaps about your whole body energy of the dragon waking up, that it wants to fill out into the inherent strength that is part of this nation. So what we're going to do here is first talk about all the incredibly beautiful attributes of what it is to be a dragon, to have the galactic DNA of a dragon. Now we have all the 13 stellar nations inside of us, so we understand it to some degree, but some of us have literally an ancestry or a lineage where that's very much a part of us. So as you watch, you can decide where you sit with that. But there's been so much wounding galactically and in our cosmic history between the great felines and the dragons, between these parts of ourselves, between the actions that the commanding dragon took, that I don't want to focus first on the wounding. We need to hear that and go over it. But the first part of this will be looking at the 8 virtues of the dragon, the initiations that we must go through to rise through to the highest aspect of being the dragon warrior who can protect and understand divine order. And then we will talk about cosmic history. Oh my goodness, what happened? But the beautiful message really in the end, just like the felines have been healed galactically, and that's what it means that it's the year of the dragon and the great feline is that galactic level of healing is coming in, impressing on our consciousness so that we can wake up to it in our lives on the third dimension, and we can start anchoring and incorporating that healing so we can change the nature of how we live with each other. So we can take that healing into our lives individually and corporately. And certainly we know that we're in a very polarized state now. We're in such a heightened sense of constant conflict and wars that are coming out through the mainstream media and actually happening in many places of the globe. But we can know as a countermeasure that this whole patterning is coming in to be woken up and to receive and accept the fact that it has been worked out on cosmic levels. And now it's up to us to integrate and live into that. So, onward. The dragon pathway is a very young, very disciplined pathway. It's a real step way to learn and master different forces. It's very much akin to the Eastern martial arts. So there are these specific 8 stars that are initiatory schools, if you will, of learning the aspects of becoming a completely fulfilled dragon warrior. And we saw in the great feline how that's much more of a yin pathway, where the understanding of how to apprehend and act with the forces around comes from within. The strategizing is kind of waiting and feeling and then knowing from within. The dragon aspect of ourself is very much about there's a systemic, disciplined training. There is a commander, in fact, and that we learn along these steps. So let's go through all these steps now to understand this. The first 4 stars represent a mastery of the elements, and this is necessary for a dragon warrior because they're literally able to create and destroy worlds. And the elements also aren't just physical qualities, they're also metaphysical qualities inside of us, which we'll see. Just as an interesting reference point, I can tell you that we'll be seeing the first 4 elements that are mastered by the dragons, and those are 4 stars or stellar worlds that are around the head of the Draco constellation. As we enter the sacred initiation pathway of the stellar nation of the dragons, I invite you to expand into your light body. And from your light body, allow yourself to gently dissolve into the life beds of each of the stars that will be visiting. Observe from within as we're surrounded by the lights of a majestic brilliance of orange and red. And this is Yoda, dragon of the fire element, on the star Rastaban at 12:17 of Sagittarius. Yoda approaches to teach the balance of the element of fire. His warrior gaze and his fervor, which is conceived in fire, projects into our eyes and consciousness, and then a plume of fire awakens from Yoda's power center to reach our power center, and it permeates our body. So begin to feel and experience from within what the mystery of the first martial virtue means. Connected here is the fire, the enthusiasm, the courageous determination of the warrior soul that comes from within. This warrior spirit calls us to task when we feel that our life is driven by a mission that we understand there's a sacred cause that we can devote ourselves to completely, even at the cost of self-surrender. And to this we give our whole heart and destiny, because this comes down to a deep determination, an awareness, a courage, and the driving force of an inner fire. We move on to the star Etemen at 2817 of Sagittarius. And here we meet Silmarillion, dragon of the water element. Balancing the water element also means a balance of the emotions. And this is extremely important for being a warrior, because learning to perfectly control the emotions with a strict discipline is something that we need to do. An emotional self is where the warrior becomes very vulnerable. So at this star, at this part of ourself, our warrior nature learns how to sublimate our desires and feelings. We live our feelings in a sacred way. We offer our desires on the altar of a service, and again, even if it's necessary to sacrifice. We learn how to focus emotions precisely, to keep them clear, to handle them with a calm, cool head. So this means even understanding how to manage the emotions that emanate from others. We learn to keep away, turn over, stay cool, to tame our own emotions and others. We can feel these waters, this movement within us, and we can ask ourselves, how do we maintain the balance of the water element? How does our warrior within follow this movement? How do we visualize it? How do we bring it to life inside of us? How do we move and control the water element? How do we clean it? Our light bodies next move to the star of Grumman at 2505 of Sagittarius. And here we meet Anchor, dragon of the earth element. Feel that the earth element represents our body strength, our physical endurance. And every warrior has to work out this very deeply. How does power appear in our body? What forces can we move and maintain and pass through our bodies? How much control do we have over our muscles, over our vibratory quality? Can we absorb the power of the earth so that it can be expressed and moved and accomplished through the body in a perfectly focused way? Do we know this power? Our dragon aspect has this power. Can we consciously possess and control this and use it in the ways that we're meant to? Our next warrior initiation is on the star of Alcaris at 2505 of Scorpio. And here we meet the dragon master San Typhoon, lord of the heavenly winds, lord of the air element. The balance of the air element in the language of warriors means to keep the thoughts clear and alert. Clarity and emptying the mind and having complete control of thoughts are extremely important. A warrior can only be a good fighter if they can keep their head and thoughts clear. If they're able to silence the cascade of inner images and thought waves that come from memories, and we have to keep our whole consciousness condensed into a single focal point. And yet, at the same time, we have to see into the thoughts of our opponents. We have to feel the intention of the opponent and even be able to think out his next move. So this is the art of pure thought for the warrior, which is undisturbed by any emotion, by temper or fear, and not any projective imagery has room to be here. Now our light body is carried to the constellation Orion, and coming to the foot of Orion, we enter the star of Rigel at 1709 of Gemini. And here is where we learn the balance of motion. So you can feel as if Iota, Silmarillion, Anchor, and San Typhon are joining forces. They form a circle around us and welcome us into the center of that circle. And from their existence together emerges a multidimensional martial wisdom as a living code of martial ethics. And this complete reality begins to speak to us. And it wants to combine the previous steps, the first 4 initiations, to create a new quality from them. Because this 5th martial virtue, the initiation here, teaches us how to move the forces awakening from the elements. And we do that according to the situation at hand. We're asked to bring these forces into clear, precisely guided sequences of movements when our soul, which is consecrated by the fate, or to this fate by divine forces, is asked to fight according to its mission. And it's asked to do this to protect the balance of forces. And then the elements, as movers of the universe, unite to oppose the opposing forces, the forces that create chaos and disorder. So this is where we learn to fight in the world of polarities, stopping at the center of the forces of light and shadow. And that's what these 4 masters, the 4 masters of the elements, teach us. They teach us to move and breathe and feel in such a way that light is born, that balance is created, order is born, and victory is born. Feel this power, this wisdom of the combined energies moving inside of you. So just as we met the other dragons on the first 4 elements, we are now meeting the great Khan, keeper of divine order, who is actually lord of this 5th element. Khan commands the elements. He gives the words to stir up the elements or to still the elements. Khan is the supreme commander of the dragon nation. And in the dragon nation, because this is a young, disciplined approach, it's appropriate to have a commander. There is a line of command because we're coming into respect for divine order. And the whole idea of there being a line of command isn't a bad one. It's not a sullying one, as we've come to see in our experience. And in fact, Khan kind of set that up because we're going to see what happens with Khan. But innately, it's respected that there's a hierarchy because it's a way of learning and it's a way of continuing to rise to your best self, to use that hierarchy as a measure, really, of how you can keep improving. So it's really an inner barometer to have this hierarchy. It gives a structure for inner evolution and betterment. We now move in our light bodies to the star of Vega at 1538 of Capricorn. And the initiation here is into the warrior's power and lordship. And what this means is realizing that we now have the ability to unite all the first 5 initiations, all those elements and forces within us. We have enormous power, but we have to learn how to manage that power well. And here the initiation for the dragon on the star Vega is to understand that this power is to be used to serve divine will. And specifically, this means that the dragon is a warrior who's guarding the winged lion part of us. The winged lion part of us is that part that's able to allow the divine frequency to run through us unimpeded. And the dragon is in service to that. That's what keeps divine order in the galaxy. The warrior aspect of us literally has power over life and death, and we can only manage that kind of power properly with great wisdom and great humility. And that's what the initiation on Vega is all about. We next move to the star of Thuban at 746 of Virgo. And the initiation here is into the warrior's mercy. So we can imagine that as warriors, we've been called to stand up against chaos and disorder. And finally, perhaps we've isolated an opponent, something that causes great chaos and disorder. And we literally have our foot on their chest with the sword hovering over, ready to take away this agent of chaos and disorder. And yet here we're asked to evaluate. We're asked to have the wisdom of whether or not we can have mercy with this opponent. Because perhaps in this whole confrontation with this opponent, that being has learned enough that they can reflect and develop and create for the universal good. And it's actually better if they stay in life and then contribute with their new wisdom to life as opposed to being taken out of life. But this is a huge responsibility and takes a great deal of discernment to know when to have mercy. And the final initiation, the 8th initiation of the Dragon Warrior, happens on Algol at 2629 of Taurus. And this is the initiation into the virtue of ruthlessness, the virtue of relentlessness. And this is when the warrior actually has to act as the hand of the divine executor. It is appropriate to take something out of creation, to cease something in creation, because it is so destructive, so chaotic, and harmful to all of creation, and therefore harming the divine order, harming the divine will. So the highest virtue here is to be able to do this. And as hard as this may be to think about, to think that if we were in this position, we'd be totally saddled with guilt or remorse or doubt, a true warrior knows so firmly that they're standing up for the divine will and the divine order, and they know so firmly what divine order is that they understand this is part of their fate, part of their mission, and the same sense of guilt doesn't necessarily come in because there's a higher perspective at work here that is especially at work with the mastery of the first 7 virtues. You come into the 8th virtue really identified with divine will to a point that you know you're in service to that, and you know with utter conviction that your actions have been taken in service to divine order and service to the whole of creation. We talked about this in the Great Feline video, and it's important to mention it again here, and that is that in our cosmic history, the Great Khan actually did not pass the initiation on Vega. So the leader of the Dragon Nation fell. The commander could not hold the truth of all these initiations at its highest. Because on Vega, while Khan was going through his initiation into the right use of power, he was utterly beguiled by his power as a force, as an ability to accomplish and do things, as a way to move elements and worlds. And when he watched the winged lion, who was also taking an initiation on Vega, and he watched the winged lion, whose initiation was about remaining steady as a leader and a ruler, and doing that by allowing the divine frequency to just run through that part of ourselves so that we could be a leader by entraining others up to that divine frequency. Khan looked at that and he's like, he's not doing anything. Surely the Creator made a mistake. And that's when Khan just started to get literally overcome by power, addicted to power, and pretty much went crazy and rogue in the galaxy. There's a few things to realize about this action of Khan's part. First of all, he was the commander. So a great many dragons followed his lead, not really understanding necessarily that it was wrong because he was the commander. There were some in the Dragon Nation who didn't follow the lead, but basically they ended up being the enemy of the rebelling dragons and were killed or not safe in the galaxy or were hiding out without a leader, really. So that really fractured the Dragon Nation, this whole part of us that stands up for divine will and divine order. Additionally, we have to understand when something like this happens, a decision like this is made, there's a vibratory quality that rings out through all of creation, and that vibration affects all sentient life. And the vibratory quality basically calls sentient life into examination. Oh, there's a new quality. What is it? Do I want to follow it? And it was very compelling to suddenly have this idea of going off with a new notion of power and being in command of oneself in a new way. So this served to add to and build up the Shadow Alliance that had already started with the War on the Angels, which happened previously. So with this, the First Galactic War broke out, and the fallen angels and the fallen dragons got together, and the dragons did a whole betrayal to the great felines, which we've covered in that other video. But basically, we can remember that the point of deep betrayal happened on the star Algebra at 2957 of Leo, which is the neck of the lion. And this is where the great feline nation and the winged lions were betrayed, many were killed, and the great feline was pushed out of the galaxy. So the whole feminine expression that followed the goddess, that was the yin energy that apprehended from within, was pushed out of the galaxy at this point. And what this point represents is a time at which darkness won. Darkness was stronger than the power of the light. And in this instance, it was so because the power of darkness was not really understood. And this instance actually kind of catalyzed the understanding that we need to know the dark in its depth as a way to understand the light. And as we saw in more detail in the great feline video, those great felines who managed to escape made their way to the Andromeda Galaxy at 2814 of Aries. With this, the Milky Way galaxy tilted into a yang dominance. The goddess, the feminine, the whole way of apprehending, feeling, and being was pushed out of the Milky Way galaxy. Interestingly, the winged lion leader, who was on the star Algebra at the time of the attack, actually knew that it was coming. It was such an underhanded attack because the angels put up an invisibility shield and the power of the dragons came through that totally unprovoked. And it was a betrayal of information that was gotten illicitly from the great felines. But this winged lion ruler knew that that attack was coming. And rather than fight back with its knowledge, that winged lion actually folded to the attack with the understanding that it was more important to keep the light alive by dying with the light inside, because had it responded in kind to the lower octave of that attack, it would have brought its own response or its own light down to that lower octave. So this was a great act of surrender and wisdom, and it actually provoked the Galactic Council to come forward to deal with these rogue elements that were causing such destruction. And the Galactic Council designated a star in the belly of the Cetus constellation that was to be a chamber of mirrors, a galactic prison, if you will. And these rogue beings were pushed into Beten Kaitos, essentially for a time out, essentially for a time to sit in the chamber of mirrors, because the idea here was if they looked at what they were, what they had become, they could take mercy, they could surrender and come back into the fold of the organic matrix. Beten Kaitos is at 22.3 of Aries, and it's basically a hell. It's a fourth dimensional star, and all these beings who had enjoyed fifth, sixth dimensional, seventh dimensional types of awareness were now contracted down into a very dark space where very little light entered. It was really them with their own feelings being projected back to them, if you will, in these mirrors so that they could see what they were, so they could potentially make other decisions. The fallen spent time in Beten Kaitos, and some souls did, in fact, accept mercy and were released, reborn. Others did not. They were so imbued with the idea of serving creation in a different way that finally the Galactic Council came forward and said they will not learn anything in this way. They need more experience to understand the consequences of their actions. And with that, these rogue beings were released from Beten Kaitos. After their release from Beten Kaitos, Khan, who had been reincarnated as Santa Elia, came together with a fallen angel, and they merged in an act of black magic into a hybrid type of satanic being. And this happened on the star Algol at 2629 of Taurus. You'll remember Algol was the eighth virtue, the eighth attainment of the dragon, the virtue of ruthlessness and relentlessness meant to be used to uphold divine law. But here that was utterly corrupted, because this satanic type of being now was all about ruthlessness in the lowest octave, and ruthlessness to promote a sense of creation, a matrix of creation that was not at all aligned with the divine matrix. Now we had a potenized shadow alliance that was also joined by fallen arthropods and fallen male serpents. And they had all lost some of their higher dimensional capacities. And they were all supercharged with a kind of overdriven sexual type of energy. And they took over the star Bungala at 2946 Scorpio, which is opposite the Pleiadian star Electra. And the daughters of Electra were just learning how to master the tantric arts of healing, of being one in the body, of serving the goddess. And they were breached by the fallen dragons and fallen male serpents. They were used as vehicles, really, to climb into the higher dimensions. So this was a very ugly part of our galactic history, and it's also a further desecration of the feminine. We can know that wars were happening all over the galaxy as the Shadow Alliance sought to take control of different stellar worlds. On the star Gizar at 1039 of Leo, the arthropod nation in particular used their technology to make all kinds of clone-like beings that rapidly expanded the numbers of the Shadow Alliance who could work their destruction on the stars and planets. When Santi Aliyah, as the reincarnated Khan and the fallen angel merged, we can know that the cradle of the dragon nation, which was the star Omega Orionis at 2449 of Gemini, at the heart of the Orion constellation, exploded. It exploded because there was such a dissonance between the truth, the purpose, the high meaning of the dragon nation versus what was actually happening. Nothing about the original dragon ideals was being carried forth, and in consequence, that star exploded. Many things happened during this devastating Second Galactic War, but we can know that the Galactic Council came forward again, and once again, the rogue beings were imprisoned in Beten Kados. But again, this imprisonment in Beten Kados after the Second Galactic War still left many beings who were not repentant, who were eventually released for more experiencing. These are beings who essentially, through different rituals, have burned the gnosis threads between their hearts and the light, between their hearts and the Creator. It's not that there's not some light inside, but it's just not their orientation. The Creator, the divine matrix, is thought of as a cult. They burn those gnosis threads because they felt like they were literally strings that were being pulled by a creator, that they were marionettes. So there's a deep kind of pushback and desire and wish for their own created matrix that at this point is so overridden by addictions to power and other things. And we see that in our world now. We're basically dealing in the stellar nations terms with the fallen dragons, the fallen angels, the fallen male serpents, and the fallen arthropods. Now it's interesting to contemplate that the eclipse we just had on April 8th, which was a Chiron Cazimi, actually had Beta Cados coming through the sun and through Chiron. And Mercury, I believe, is retrograding now back into Beta Cados. Beta Cados is in the skies, coming through various planetary bodies. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean something for us now? Will there be some kind of call for these rogue elements to have another opportunity, if you will, to go into the chamber of mirrors? Certainly for us, for all of us, really, it's a time for inner reflection, to go into a chamber of mirrors and decide what our values are, how we want to move forward. We can understand now with all this information that those who followed Khan perhaps suffer the greater psychological wound because they went on to attack and serve the ambition for power. And they may have done it because of self-ambition, or they may have done it because they were bound by the word of command and they lacked the strength or the awareness to rebel and push back against that. So those who joined Khan actually probably have the deeper wound than those who didn't, who rebelled at that time in the sense of not joining Khan, and they probably lost their lives because they were not in the fold of what was happening. But losing their life at that point wasn't as hard a thing as this deep ongoing psychological wound of having denied creation. Now, those who were loyal to the virtues of the dragon but couldn't do it with a leader had no leader. So what happened for a very long time in cosmic history, essentially the Holy Spirit, which is the 13th stellar nation, was their leader. And the Holy Spirit is the quantum field that contains everything. So the impression of what it would be to be a noble dragon was contained in that quantum field. It's there, but that's a very subtle leader. It's not really like having a leader in the true sense of a dragon would understand with a command. So you can understand that galactically, this whole aspect of ourselves, really, this aspect that is asking to understand divine order and divine will, hasn't been fully functional and has been very injured. So with only the Holy Spirit as a leader, really the best that could happen is that those carrying dragon warrior codes who were following the Holy Spirit in a sense could feel or would need to feel the spiritual qualities of the dragon from within and work them out from within if they could raise their consciousness and their being enough to receive the high vibrational qualities that do come from the Holy Spirit. And also in practical terms, particularly on Earth, we've got the larger and smaller communities that actually follow the martial arts. And that's a way for someone with very strong dragon codes to exercise that galactic heritage and their soul urge. They could sublimate it into being in part of a martial arts community and achieving along those lines. Meanwhile, in the higher dimensional realities of galactic history, a rehabilitation process naturally began. There was the development in several ways of a new way that the dragons could express their existence. And we saw that this worked out for the great felines in the Andromeda galaxy. Well, a process has been at work also for the dragons. And that's what we'll look at next. Omega Orionis at 2449 Gemini, which had been a star at the heart of the Orion constellation and had been the cradle of the Dragon Nation, and we realize it exploded when Khan merged with the angel. It's a fragment of a star now, but what it has become is a sanctuary of an inner pilgrimage where dragon warriors who are really eager to awaken and leave their wrong path wake up and seek their own purification here. These very guilty dragons wanting to seek redemption fell into Omega Orionis, and it's like a chamber of mirrors. They fall into it completely alone. And in this chamber of mirrors, it's like they're on a personal kind of celestial El Camino, you know, that walk in Spain where you just keep going to discover yourself. So with this chamber of mirrors, they're seeing projected all the mistakes they made, all the erroneous dagger thrusts, and what caused anguish to others, and how the consequences of losing their divine fate played out. They saw the loss of their dignity. All this flashed before them, and this helped them to eventually start to feel some kind of understanding. They had to learn to overcome this. A warrior has to account for their actions and their movements, made and sometimes not made. And it's a little tricky because a warrior doesn't have guilt in the same way. If an action is made for a righteous purpose, in line with their mission, it's okay. It doesn't need to incite guilt. But here we're talking about the souls that realized that they didn't follow the righteous path. And when we have soul fragments that are injured like this, it makes us very vulnerable in our incarnated lives when things come up. They're points of weakness that can unconsciously pull us into situations that we really don't want to be in for our development, but yet this injured soul particle somehow is triggered and doesn't deal with it. So this whole cosmic mirror space on Omega Orionis is a very, very important inner pathway for the healing of that warrior's guilt for leaving their true path. Underneath Omega Orionis, there is sort of between the legs of Orion constellation a huge nebula, which is the birthplace of stars. And here we also have the birth of galactic redemption for the dragons, because here we had two master spirits awakening in the place of this nebula. It's like two new stars came into formation. So what this means is that 2 points of strength have developed in the Dragon Nation. Effectively, 2 new commanders have come forth to replace Khan. And it's a whole different model of leadership. And let's look at what that means and how that came about and how it invites our dragon aspects to move forward in a new way. And the way this has developed is that these 2 master spirits are born who've embarked on the path of initiation, but they developed their abilities in these 8 martial virtues to the highest level one after another, mastering the different levels, refining them. But they did this by constantly testing their strength and abilities with each other. It's as if they were sparring, if you will, but it's not the idea that it's a polarized sparring. It's not the light against the dark. It's a sparring, really, that allows one to use the other as an oppositional force that allows them to increase and refine and make better their own inner qualities. So they're not going against the other, they're just using the catalyst of the other to elevate their own abilities. So one day, one master wins a battle by a hair's breadth, and the next day, the other wins by a hair's breadth. And they're following an almost never-ending inner drive to always transcend themselves. And then as they transcend themselves, they can surpass the strength and skills of the other. But this is not as opponents, but rather as fellows developing with each other. So this is a new idea or a new pattern that's come to life that is being born within the stellar race of the dragons, and actually, of course, then a pattern for us with our own dragon codes. So now we have the birth of these two new dragon grandmasters, each representing a different quality, which we'll look at next. But we've got Sante Kanmar Torak and Thork Vain Dam Amarind. For ease, we'll call them Sante and Thork as we go on. Sante, in his birth, really mastered the initiation of Vega, which is what Khan failed. And he did this by following the deepest inner impetus, this whole intention inside. Show me how I can best guard divine will and divine order. How can I guard the bastions of light again? How can I best serve the higher divine plan with my physical and mental strength? So by constantly bettering himself with this in mind, he mastered Vega. He mastered the initiation into power and the right use of power. The soul of the other grandmaster that awakened in the Orion Nebula, Thork, did this by falling through the corridor of the warrior's guilt. And as he fell into the guilt, he clung to the light. He rose in grace through the star Thuban, which is the seventh initiation of the dragon. And Thuban is where the warrior learns to use mercy for themselves or for the other. So by mastering Thuban, Thork was able to create a new state of being through redemption. He basically healed the guilt of himself and really for the nation by accepting this mercy and allowing the act of redemption to return him back to the original dragon codes. And in the vein of Thork's redemption through mercy, this also ties into sort of a subgroup of dragons who are trying to heal that emerged in the time of Jesus coming to earth. And that was Jesus actually assigned certain lost dragons in the form of humans at the time. I mean, they had heavy dragon codes, but they were human. He assigned them to guard his temple, to guard the temple of the Christ consciousness. And that's a very distinct kind of service as a warrior of light to the Bear Nation. And there are 4 stars that were revealed for this kind of service. And these are called Jeromean warriors. They're still very much dragons, but they are impressed with the service to the whole Christ consciousness. And there were 4 stars revealed in 2012, which was the year of the bears, which taught us more about the history of the Christ consciousness through creation from Lemurian times till now. And we'll just quickly look at those stars, because those also speak to this guarding, upholding nature of the warrior, of the dragon. These 4 stars are in the Lupus constellation or the Wolf constellation, and they represent the wolf that died when guarding the temple of Christ. And this is the archetypical pattern for the protective guardian quality of the warrior. And this whole background story is further elucidated in the book Calling You. But first we have Gamma Lupi at 150 of Sagittarius. And this just represents the faith and the determination and eternal loyalty to the master or leader. And that shines forth in a person's soul if they have this stellar ray coming through them. The second Lupus star is Beta Lupi at Scorpio 2521. This represents the courage and the strength of the warrior. And there's an anger, temper, drive with which the warrior will, without doubt or any fear, strike whoever attacks the person or community or ideology or temple that they're defending. The Epsilon Lupi star at 27 of Sagittarius does represent a wound. It can be a wounded part of ourself, because this is where the centaur's arrow in the story hits the body of the wolf dog who is guarding the temple with heroic determination, and it hits in the solar chakra, almost sucking the life force out of it. So if we have this stellar ray, there's that real determination, but on the other hand, that wounding can kind of represent a quality of shirking back. You know, when we see animals who have been hurt, they're shy of being around people. They may shirk in a corner and cower. So there can be a little bit of that, because the wound is something that's known and remembered. Lastly, we have Phi Lupi at Scorpio 2749. And this is a star that adorns the mouth and nose of the celestial wolf constellation. And it points to the fact that these are important tools for being a protective fighting being. Meaning the nose is that kind of sensibility that can sniff out or smell danger. And the mouth literally can bite or can use words in its protective impulses. And it bears saying that in 2011, we also had the Year of the Dragons and the Great Felines impressing on our collective unconscious. And that's the point at which we started to really understand that a warrior could be more noble than we had in our consciousness, because we just thought of wars. We didn't understand this higher principle really. And Khan, very definitely, his whole energy came to Earth at that point, trying to gather up the fallen ones, who essentially he's marked, which is not very pleasant, but he feels he has a hold on. And that's why it's important to heal these aspects of ourselves, because if his influence touches in again on a wounded part, it may pull us into something without us really realizing it. And now 2024, this whole lower fallen influence of Khan is very active in our third dimensional. We can see this with the outbreaks of conflicts everywhere. And it's really a time of trying to heal any of these feelings inside of us from past dragon wounding, so we are not vulnerable. Because again, when this happens, that such a strong force of the Shadow Alliance comes, it creates a vibration in the field. And whether we know it or not, that vibration is pushing on us saying, what do you want? What do you want? Do you want to go this way or that way? Hey, this looks good, this kind of power, or falling into this structure. Yeah, let's do it. But it's not in line with our highest good or highest awareness. So this is something to be aware of. The inner and outer struggle is very activated along these warrior codes this year. But the good news is there's a new prototype, as we just saw, in the galactic. We don't have to fall into the old pattern, particularly if we become aware and can heal our soul particles. And part of healing our soul particles is really just sort of a surrender and an ability to accept mercy, to accept grace, to understand that we can be lifted back. So just as a reminder and reference back to the first video on the great felines and their healing, that's the other warrior nation coming in this year, the whole feminine and the goddess. And just like the dragons now have two grandmasters, the goddess representation is Myanmar Ankh, who we learned about in the other video. But there's this beautiful, grounded, and very focused feminine warrior force that's back, that's also can be worked with our dragon side. So we can rest in the confidence that on the galactic level, so much healing has been done, and the prototypes and patterns are there vibrationally for that kind of change to come to us as individuals and to us collectively on Earth. In conclusion, in this year of 2024, we as cosmic humans, in our light bodies and in our physical bodies, are in the energetic soup, if you will, of meeting our dragon and our great feline codes. And so we swirl around, as we now saw, with some new patterns. We've got Sante, we've got Thork, we've got Myanmar Ankh, and we've got the Jeromium warrior guarding the Christ consciousness, or the higher 5th, 6th, 7th dimensional levels of consciousness. And that's a lot of information. What do we do with it? In the end of the great feline, I suggested a very simple thing, and that is, if we can go into our hearts, ignite our heart qualities, which is actually what the bear nation, or the bear part of ourselves, shows us and teaches us, we can raise above the polarities and start to understand our creation cycle in a non-polarized way. We can move into more of a 5th dimensional collective consciousness, individually and together. And the very first thing, as simple as it sounds, is the quality of forgiveness, self-forgiveness, and forgiveness for one another, because that takes the energy block away that helps open up other things. And I did do a video on the heart qualities as shown through the Bear Nation, and I will link that below. So with that, thank you for watching, and may we all really rise together. Thank you.